Some of the biggest breakthroughs that I've had in my language learning that I can think about have come as a result of... Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to the Story Learning Podcast. I hope you're having a great week. If you're watching on video right now, you might notice my eyes are a little bit funny. So, quick story in case you're interested. So, I just got contact lenses for the first time, and I'm quite cool about it. Like, I'm 44 years old, and I've never had glasses, so I feel like I've done quite well on the eyesight front. But recently, I've been playing a lot of tennis, and I've noticed that when the ball gets hit on the other side of the court, it takes me a good second or so for the ball to turn from fuzzy into sharp. And I think my far sight is not what it used to be. And it's causing me problems playing tennis because I don't know where the ball is going until it's already over the net. And that's a bit of a problem. So anyway, I got these contact lenses, and I went and I got them fitted. In the optician, they showed me how to put it in, take it out. I felt like I was back at school again. And I said, yeah, no problem. Anyway, so I got home last night and I couldn't take the damn things out. I was just like stabbing away at my eyes. I'd been taught all the techniques. I even started looking up on YouTube where there's like different fancy ways of taking out contacts. And I didn't do a very good job of it. And my eyes, as a result, are a little bit worse for wear this morning. So that is why I look slightly stoned this morning. So for those of you listening on audio, it's not going to make the blindest bit of difference, but I thought I would tell you that quick anecdote anyway. So with that said, let's move into something completely different, which is a very interesting question about things that I wish I knew about language learning before I started. This question comes from @TBountyBay3080, which is a really intriguing handle, actually. Bounty Bay. I'm wondering where that is. Like maybe it's in the Caribbean or something. I don't know, but I'm very curious to find out. Anyway, @TBountyBay3080 asks, what has been language learning advice that once you applied it gave you better results? Now, the question is very well worded, but it actually underplays the question, I think, a little bit. The question underplays itself, because I think what @TBountyBay is asking, what are some things you've learned about the language learning process that actually really made a difference? Some deep truths. Because there are all kinds of techniques and tricks and things that you can do to learn a language, right? But they're all just that. It's like tactical stuff, technique stuff. What's being asked here is, what are some deep truths that you've learned over the years that you'd like to pass down to the next generation, as it were? And I really like that because, I mean, I, as you may know, I mean, I think a lot about language learning. My whole pedigree is in languages. Even though I didn't do languages at university, I did music. But like after that, I spent the last 25 years learning languages, taught languages, master's degrees, all of that stuff. So I enjoy thinking a lot about languages. And so this question really got my juices flowing because it got me thinking, well, what are things that are kind of universally true that I would want people to know about? I've got 3 things for you today. And the thing about these 3 things is that they're not necessarily helpful or practical for you to do anything with right now, but it's the kind of thing that if you enjoy thinking about languages and language learning, then it's just kind of intellectually stimulating. And I think they do act as something of a North Star, meaning if you know that these things are true, it helps to contextualize everything else that you do. So if you're having a problem or a struggle of some kind, knowing these truths can prevent that from becoming a big deal for you, right? Because you can understand why it's happening, and that can make it feel a lot better. So anyway, let's dive right in with number 1, which is to start with the whole and not the parts. Start with the whole and not the parts. So there's 2 parts to this statement. There's the word start, and then there's the whole, not the parts. So the whole, not the parts, refers to studying the whole language, and for it always being in context, in its fullest version, rather than studying small little discrete bits. So for example, if you are learning Chinese characters in Mandarin Chinese or Japanese, a lot of the time, which is what I did, people will learn these characters separately, individually, like as the part, and they'll build up over time. But the challenge with that is that you end up with an incomplete knowledge because you haven't seen these Chinese characters in context in the real world where they're actually used, right? Because you've been studying the part, not the whole. So the approach of studying the whole would be to say, right, we're actually going to go out and just study these Chinese characters in the real world as they come up in my life, whether that's reading a book or on the train or in the bank or whatever it may be. And we're taking everything in context, and when we need to study it, we'll study it, but we're coming from the whole, not from the part. Another example would be vocabulary. It's very common to use flashcards to learn vocabulary. And when you're at school, you might remember lists of words going up on the blackboard, and you have to learn lists of words, individual words. This is the part, not the whole. The whole would be, for example, reading a book of short stories. And when you see some vocabulary that you don't know, well, then you might kind of guess what that is, or maybe even look it up. But it's coming from this rich context of the story, and you're looking it up when it's needed. It's completely different to do it that way than to say, okay, here's this list of stuff that I'm going to take as an object of study. I'm going to learn it, memorize it, and approach my studying that way. Almost the entire language learning industry is based on learning the part, not the whole, right? So that works because it feels easier to study. It feels more manageable. Everything becomes more bite-sized, right? A textbook can introduce a list of words that you shouldn't learn, or a grammar rule that you should learn, because it makes for easy studying. But that's almost like just for the textbook's sake, right? Not for yours. Instead of doing it that way, if you start with the whole, you just get so much more information over time. You're so much more informed. Everything you learn, you actually know how to use it properly. It just makes for, in the long run, a better journey. I think it's harder in the short term, right? Especially if you're new to language learning and you don't quite know what to do. But over the long term, starting with the whole gets you so much further, faster. So that's point one, start with the whole and not the parts. The next is to not force it. Don't force it. There were so many times, I think, when I was learning languages in the past where it was kind of like I put pressure on myself. And sometimes this was because often when I was studying a new language, actually, and I wanted to learn quickly, sometimes I will confess, it was kind of a byproduct of having a YouTube channel and an online brand and feeling like I needed to learn more languages. I would kind of take up a new project. I would put a lot of pressure on myself, try to learn faster. So there was that element to it as well. But what I've noticed is that a lot of language learners do tend to put pressure on themselves and to force it when they would rather not. And, in a way that goes against their nature somewhat. And I think what I realized in the long run is that always backfires. And some of the biggest breakthroughs that I've had in my language learning that I can think about have come as a result of doing the opposite of forcing it. So I have my story of my breakthrough in Spanish when I was up in the mountains in Argentina. If you don't know this story, you can go and find it on my website. You can go to StoryLearning.com and then click on the About page. I've written a long story about that there. But basically, it was when I was up in the middle of the night because I had some altitude sickness and I couldn't breathe properly. So I was just like sitting up in the moonlight at 3 a.m., barely able to breathe. And I just grabbed this book in Spanish and I started reading through it, mostly because I was just trying to pass the time. I was reading through this book and I had no agenda. I wasn't trying to force it. I was just reading for the experience of it. And that's when I realized for the first time that I could understand so much more than I thought if I just allowed myself to. And so this experience of just letting it happen naturally at the right time for me led to a big breakthrough. There was a similar one years later when I was learning Cantonese and I was a bit burned out from having got home from work and tried to study for 2 hours every evening. So I just said, right, screw it. What I'm going to do is watch TV. So I put on this TV series called Triumph in the Skies. It was like 96 episodes or something. It was ridiculous. But I thought, look, I'm not going to keep studying, but I can lie horizontally and watch TV. So I did it, and I ended up watching hundreds of hours of Cantonese on TV. The very opposite of forcing it. But that experience allowed a huge wave of language to wash over me, and my pronunciation and my vocabulary and my intonation, everything improved so much as a result. If you find yourself forcing it with language learning, like it's always a ticking clock. There's always going to be a point at which you give up, you can't sustain it, and it's counterproductive in the end. But if you can find the path of least resistance, if you can find the way of studying that feels fun, that feels enjoyable, that it means that you will keep it up for the long run, that is the ultimate win. Because of course, in the end, language learning is always a marathon and not a sprint. And with all these little anecdotes I'm telling you, by the way, one of the most effective things you can do once you realize how these things work is actually to plan out this study routine for yourself. And I've got a language goal planner that actually helps you collect some of these ideas, write them down, and then plan some actions and stick to them. It's a pretty simple worksheet, but sometimes writing these things down and being intentional about it, it makes the difference between you doing something and not. So if you'd like this language goal planner, you can click on the link in the description. It's completely free, and you can download it over there. So we start with the whole and not the parts. And then the second point was not to force it. The third is that languages are emotional. Or to put it another way, you have to respect the role of emotions in language. And if I think about so many of the challenges that I've had with language learning, it's often been an emotional thing. Right? There's been emotions involved, or I have been like, a classic example would be having an opportunity to speak to someone in the language, but then my emotions get the better of me. I might have some like social anxiety or something, or I might not have the confidence to speak. And that thing there, that the fact that exists ends up sabotaging myself, because were it not for those nerves or the associated emotions, I might just go and just talk to people and then, make new friends and get more practice at the language. I've learned not to ignore the role of emotions in language learning because it's ever present. And on the flip side, when you can harness your emotions, you really create a huge advantage for yourself. So, for example, I remember when I first started learning Spanish, I was in my early 20s, and one of the ways that I learned quite quickly was my best friend was from the Canary Islands where they speak Spanish. And we were friends via music, right? We weren't friends for language reasons. We were friends because of music. We were playing music together, going out and seeing gigs and things like that. But we were also speaking in Spanish the whole time. And so I was highly motivated to learn Spanish, not because of the language, although that was a big part of it for me, but primarily because I had this friend who I spent tons and tons of time with, and that became the kind of emotional anchor for learning, and it gave the whole learning project a completely different color. Because if it wasn't for my friend Tomas, I I don't know if I would have kept up learning Spanish, because like, what does it mean to me exactly? What are the associated emotions? And it was kind of like, I think when I started learning Spanish, to a large extent, it was because I just thought it was a cool thing to do and I could. But that's not sustainable by itself. What really makes a difference is when you have this emotional anchor to your learning. And so, this is not, again, it's one of those things, it's like, what do you do with this nugget that I'm giving you now? I don't know. But if all that comes from this is that you learn to identify when emotions are influencing you negatively, or on the flip side, you learn to identify where you've got positive emotions that could help you, well, that could allow you to kind of lean into your language learning in a slightly different way. The time when that I've never forgotten, where like embarrassment was an important factor in my language learning, was when I was working in a youth hostel in France. I was working behind reception, and there was a little kitchenette in the youth hostel, and these two there were a bunch of people sort of hanging out in the youth hostel, cooking and doing their thing. And there were these two French guys who came up to me, and I was behind the reception desk, and they came up to me and they asked me if I have any couverture. And couverture means blankets. And it was like 6 p.m. or something. I was like, what are your blankets for? It's like 6 p.m. and I'm busy, so I'll come to you in a minute. So I kind of went about doing what I was doing and serving some other customers who were trying to check in. I was very busy. And about half an hour later, or 20 minutes later, I kind of went back to them and said, I've got your couverture. And I just handed them these two blankets. But of course, what they actually wanted was the couvert, which is cutlery, knives and forks, because they just cooked themselves a big bowl of pasta, and they wanted some knives and forks to eat it with. And so I kind of went up there like a complete muppet with these two blankets, And they were sitting there with these stone cold bowls of pasta looking quite unhappy. And I was so ashamed because it was my poor French that had let me down in that moment, right? But I never forgot those words. And 25 years later, I still remember them like it was yesterday. Such is the role of emotion in language learning. So those are the three things that come to mind when I think of like really deep truths with language learning. We've got start with the whole and not the parts. We've got don't force it. And then we've got the role of emotions in language learning and just how important they are to the whole process. So I hope that's been interesting to listen to, and I'll see you back in the next episode of the Story Learning podcast.